No, there's a sort of weird world out there, and it exists in Westminster, but across both main parties. You can't mention the term genocide. You can't mention the term apartheid, even though every major human rights organization in the world says basically that Israel is not only committing apartheid, but it's committing genocide. But that is not acceptable in political discourse. And so you have a parallel reality existing in the media political system.
In the immediate aftermath of the events of October 7th, it was almost as if the British media had a line about what needed to be said, about what had to happen next. It was almost as if things were being coordinated. There was a similar feeling when it came to the political class too. Dissent was not allowed. Simply asking questions about the facts, which after all is integral to the function of journalism, was seen as something beyond the pale. In the months and years that followed, Britain hasn't just observed with indifference events in Gaza, it has actively participated, supporting an Israeli state which is responsible, in the eyes of many, for genocide. That involvement, that complicity, is documented in a very important new book by Peter Oborne, Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. Peter has decades of experience in Britain's media. He was, among other things, the political editor of The Spectator. He's now at Middle East Eye. Peter Oborne, such a pleasure to have you back. Welcome to Downstream.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Welcome back to Downstream,
Indeed.
I should say.
Yeah. Last time I think we discussed the Conservative Party.
Yeah, the collapse, the imminent collapse, as it was at that point, just shortly before the general election of the Conservative Party. Altogether more serious things, though, up for debate today. The subject of your latest book, Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you very much.
I've recommended it to my colleagues on Novara Live because it's just a compendium of just all of the horrors that have happened over the last couple of years. And you've got tables about what organizations have labeled it a genocide. You've got, lists of what various figures in public life in Israel have said about Gaza and cheering on crimes against humanity, et cetera, et cetera. It really is fantastic. What made you want to publish it? And when did you make that decision to publish this book about our complicity in the war?
Well, I can tell you it was a very specific moment. I was in Nablus. There's a fabulous hostel there in an old Ottoman house, and you can sit on the top on the rooftop terrace. And I was sitting there one evening in late October, just around the time when the Iranian missiles, which you could see, I hadn't actually, but people could see, watch them go over from Iran to Tel Aviv. And I suddenly thought, I've got to write this book. And I realized, and the reasons were, I actually felt a mission to do so because I was a political journalist for about 20 years, active columnist, and then a reporter, and then a columnist. I understand British politics and how it works. And then since then, I spent a lot of time with Middle East Eye, writing about the Middle East, in particular, West Bank, Gaza, Israel, and the greater Middle East. I also did a film. I was asked to do this by Channel 4 on the pro-Israel lobby in Britain. So I knew the sort of internal politics. It was very, very interesting film to make and very difficult to make as well. But it left me with a knowledge of how the Israel lobby works in this country. And finally, I've written 2 books on political lying. And at the heart of the Gaza story is a series of lies about what the Israelis have been doing. And one of the core points about the political lying, which I set out in the 2 books I've written, is, of course, it's only possible to lie if you're a politician, which has now become an epidemic, if the press allow you to do so. And the press has enabled the lies to go out. And I wrote this book also as a rebuttal, really, of the fabricated stories told about Israel in Gaza over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah. What was your initial response to October the 7th?
Well,
over the following, not that day, but over the following days and that week, as we sort of collectively made sense of what had happened and the implications?
Well, you got the reports very quickly of the massacres in the Nova party and in the kibbutzes, and they were kind of disgusting. And so, but I mean, very early on, it looked, when you got they'd overrun military bases, that was, it looked possible that this was an extraordinary achievement, that there was, Hamas is a military organization, it's resisting occupation, a military occupation, and that looked, but then very quickly we learnt about the slaughter of innocent people, and so it was disgusting, and so it was a sense of horror after that, yeah.
But I suppose, what were your initial feelings? I mean, speaking personally, within about 24 hours, I just thought, it's weird because often in politics you can predict far less than you think, right? Predictions are often always wrong. But with this, if you were to ask me the day after it happened, okay, well, what happens next? I would say the IDF is just going to dismantle Gaza and the West is going to do nothing about it. You could
have predicted it. I think that's probably right. On the other hand, it became clear within about a week or less even that was going to happen. You got the series of genocidal statements by senior Israeli officials and politicians and military people, really terrifying remarks. And then you got the bombing starting, and the loss of life, it became obvious, was devastating, like 400 people being killed, entire families being worked out a day, and entire families being eliminated. I think it was 5,000 dead by the end of October. That's in about 3 weeks.
Yeah,
that's about 2 to 4, but about 300 people a day. So it was very, very quickly you could see that the Israeli response was completely disproportionate.
That retort of Keir Starmer when he was speaking to LBC, which you talk about in the book, I suppose that for me was the first surprise, in that you had a leader of the opposition, everything went to the script, but you had a leader of the opposition overtly defend crimes against humanity. That was the first time where I thought, okay, actually, this may be even worse than I imagined, which was already pretty bad. Was that a slip-up, or was that part of conscious Labour policy and opposition? Or, what's your view on it? You write about that particular moment.
Well, I think it was that Starmer is one of the leading human rights lawyers in the world. Nobody understands human rights better than him. And so there's no question that as a human rights lawyer, he would have understood that collective punishment was wrong and a war crime. On the other hand, I think that he felt that he had to support Israel, and that the reason for that was political. That here he is, that potentially looks like being the next prime minister, and if he's going to go off, particularly after his anti-Corbyn crusade, you might call it, he was going to split his party. He was, above all, going to send a message to the United States, to Joe Biden's White House, that he couldn't be trusted as a reliable ally of the US. And I think that was, and you can see, if you look at his eyes, I think he knows that. He's trying to, when he's asked by Nick Ferrari, it's a very good question, really. He sort of says, but tries to better get away with both. Yes, it does have that right, but at the same time, it must obey international law. It's gibberish, but you can see the dilemma that the future prime minister found himself in.
And then the next day we have Emily Thornbury say basically the same thing.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, exactly, what can't have been a mistake. There must have been an assessment of that remark. And I think that a number of senior members of the shadow cabinet went out and repeated it, and it took about 8 days for Starmer to start to rave back on it.
Yeah, that was a huge moment. And of course, Lamy said the same thing as well. And your point there about him being one of the most senior human rights lawyers in the world, memorably, and you lay this out in the book, I was aware of it, but I wasn't, familiar with the intricacies of it. Keir Starmer makes an argument not that long ago to the relevant legal authorities about Serbia having committed a genocide against...
He fights the case at the ICJ, yeah.
Right. Talk about this a little bit, because I don't think that many people are aware of it.
Right. Croatia had a case against Serbia in the wake of the Balkans horrors. That genocide was committed against Croats, and it was I looked at the way in which Starmer presented this case. It was quite similar to Gaza, sort of the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians. No doubt that that they'd expressed intent, and hospitals, schools, etc. So the case he made could have been made. And was made, actually. Sorry, it was very similar to the case brought by the South Africans at the ICJ, and Starmer clearly believed in it because he wasn't just a lawyer accepting a brief. He'd had his spell at the public prosecutor, and he was about to go into politics. But when they lost, they did lose, and they lost on the grounds that they couldn't prove intention by the Serbs. And Starmer got a bit querulous about it. He sort of objected. He sent out a tweet saying he thought the rules ought to be changed for these judgments. And so I think he was committed to that. But he did have and does have a better understanding of the law surrounding genocide, really, than almost anybody else in the world.
And it's in 2014, isn't it?
That's in 2014.
It's a year before he becomes an MP.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you really lay it out so well in the book. Play for play, the exact same arguments are made, like you say, by the South Africans more recently regarding Gaza. Do you think in his heart of hearts, and I know you're the sort of journalist that doesn't like to talk about people's motivations and their inner thoughts, their inner life, but surely he must recognise that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide because he made the exact same arguments regarding Croatia and the Serbs. It
must have shaped Starmer. Now, admittedly, even though he brought the case very coherently, he did lose it, and it may be that shaped his view that Gaza isn't a genocide either. On the other hand, with Sir Keir Starmer, I think there is a lot of political expediency coming into play. He's the prime minister now. He has a relationship with the White House. He has a relationship with Israel. And before then, when he was leader of the opposition, he was determined that nothing would stop him getting into Downing Street. So I think that he had political motives to reach the judgment that a genocide is not going on.
You've got this beautifully laid out on page 150. And again, like I say, play for play, the political doctrine of Serbian expansionism, which creates the climate for genocidal policies aimed at destroying the Croatian population living in areas earmarked to become part of Greater Serbia. Statements of public officials, passive attacks on groups of Croats, contemporaneous video footage. You even include, I mean, it's almost beyond belief. Starmer citing Serbian forces attacking hospitals, which again has been a striking, I mean, and it's just something that I really wasn't that familiar with. And what's really extraordinary is Starmer arguing that the destruction of a group, and this is his words, a group or part of a group does not require extermination of all members of the group or even a substantial part of it. It is not a numbers game, he insisted. And then, of course, more recently, David Lammy says, well, it can't be a genocide in Gaza because it's not millions of people dying.
Yes. David Lammy is a bit of, doesn't emerge as a very serious figure, I'm afraid, from this book. He talks an awful lot of nonsense. And as Foreign Secretary, he did. But Starmer is, he's a serious lawyer. And he didn't need to say there isn't a genocide. He could simply have said we await the verdict of the court, the ICJ.
But then you make an equally important point, which is you can think that and you can say that, but nations are also legally obliged to intervene and stop a genocide. So it's one thing to say post factum, we'll wait and see what the ICJ says, but we also have a legal obligation to intervene. So, I mean, this is the argument that's made, of course, by the Houthis, isn't it, with regard to their shutting down of the waters. They say there's a legal basis for what they're doing.
But more importantly, not more relevantly here, the fact that the ICJ made its ruling and sent its instructions to Israel to take steps to avert the possibility of a genocide was a warning shot to everybody else in the world, every chancellery in Europe and America and to Britain. Look, there's a possible genocide. They were told. And so this, first of all, that applies to Sunak and Cameron, who were until the election, and thereafter it's applied to the Starmer government, particularly since Israel has ignored the orders of the ICJ. You know, it did go into Rafah. It has withheld aid, and so on and so on and so forth. And so the British, this is legally important because when you go further down the line, and if this is to be determined to be a genocide, and I think the chances are it will be, there is a clear legal case against very senior British ministers that they have been complicit in a genocide. They have aided and abetted. You look at the International Criminal Court Act, it's completely clear that if you aid and abet a genocide, that is an offence under British law.
I hope you're finding this conversation stimulating, informative, maybe challenging. Those are words we want associated with Downstream here at Novara Media. Our project at Novara is to build a new media for different politics through our articles, podcasts, videos, social first content. We want to have a more bold, informative conversation about what this country looks like at home and how we conduct ourselves abroad as well. If you want to help build that new media in 2026, why not get on that train? Go to novaramedia.com/support. We're trying to do something really important. Like I say, we cannot shift politics without shifting the conversation first. Be a part of it. Go to novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description below. Well, this is the key point, right? So walk us through, because people have heard these arguments just being circulated and they don't know the specifics. So in all likelihood, or quite plausibly, it will be a genocide. All the arrows seem to be directing in around that direction. We have the alleged complicity of people like Sunak, Cameron, more recently Lamy, Starmer. So what would it look like? What's the sequence of events for any of those people to face legal accountability? Who would have to push that agenda, and what would the process look like?
Well, presumably a case would be taken by lawyers to the government, to the Attorney General, wouldn't it? It eventually goes to the Attorney General that there's a case here that the International Criminal Court Act has been violated. And the final decision rests with the Attorney General. And there, of course, is the get-out clause, because the Attorney General is an appointee of the Prime Minister, and he's very unlikely to say, go ahead. And so that, I think, is what they're depending on. Tony Blair's advice from his Attorney General ahead of the Iraq War contained that point that there is a protection within the British system that it won't go after you even if you are guilty of that sort of crime.
But if there is, in 10, 20 years, an unfavourable Attorney General who might seek to prosecute that case, I mean, that's quite significant, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. I suppose Polanski...
It's not impossible.
No, it's not. And I think it's... if you look at the current situation politically, I think it might well become an issue in the general election, because there's likely to be a ICJ decision before the next election. And certainly, I imagine the Greens. We should ask them, actually, will they be pressing charges in the event of an ICJ decision? And then, parallel to this, and I don't fully understand the process, but the Bindman's lawyer, Tayyab Ali, and has got an organisation which is based really around the idea that if the British system is going to protect war criminals or those suspected of war crimes, then really the others must go after them. And so he's looking to form international alliances, sort of an alternative ICC. A big sign, actually, of the collapse of the Western rules-based order, that if the West isn't prepared to stand up to the values which we say we support, then others may have to do that instead. And this is a sort of we've had South Africa very significantly coming out really as a spokesman, as an advocate for the global South, saying, look, we stand up for justice even if you don't, and that South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, has come and made that case at the ICJ and taken it on from there. It's really significant in terms of, and that the West is determined. Look, I mean, I go into this, and it's more and more is coming out, to hinder the work of the International Criminal Court, which we ourselves set up, but precisely because it goes after our allies, i.e., Netanyahu and Gallant and others potentially. This is very, very, we don't. And Starmer never complains when the United States goes after the United Nations. More than 300 UNRWA workers have been killed, targeted, I dare say, in many cases by the Israelis. There's no complaints from us that the United Nations people are being, any more than UNIFIL is being attacked by the Israelis in South Lebanon. Do we ever complain about this? And so we don't. We have made a decision. British leaders have made a decision, and to support the United States, or at least not demur from the United States in a war on the global institutions which were set up after 1945 in order to prevent a recurrence of the horror of World War II.
And which massively favour this country. I mean, if you look, but Britain, by any meaningful measure, Britain should not be a member of the UN Security Council in 2025. The idea that you would try and undermine these institutions, which give us and the French far more power than we probably deserve.
Soft power, power than we deserve. We are, by the way, I just chuck this into the conversation. There's almost certainly a genocide going on in Sudan. I've just come back from there. Who is the penholder for Sudan? Britain, as the former colonial power. No, this is a sort of serious issue. Who was the penholder in Myanmar? Britain. Who was the penholder in Yemen? Britain. And I feel that we are betraying everything we claim to believe in our continuing to supply arms to as I list them. The majority of serious experts are quite clear that a genocide is going on in Gaza, and yet Britain is continuing to supply arms, to give diplomatic support, to host, military involvement, etc.
Again, in terms of this being a really useful compendium, a reference work, you list all the organisations and bodies that have said there's a genocide in Gaza, from B'Tselem in Israel to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. Really, really useful. You're talking about the sort of values that we've given up on, the post-war values. Of course, they weren't always observed since 1945, but even if you're claiming to adhere to something, that's important. You talk about the Atlantic Charter as having collapsed, and you refer to it as a magnificent vision. Of course, this was the basis of that post-war order, and I believe 1941, Newfoundland.
Well, that was when Churchill met Roosevelt, basically at the height of the Nazi power, shortly after the invasion of Russia, and Churchill, it's very pregnant with significance, and this forms the basis for the United Nations, And Britain basically sets up the UN. It first meets in Britain, and our readiness to dump all of that, along with the United States, is very profound, and it's going to have massive consequences as we go ahead in the next few years.
I mean, dumping is the right word, but also there's a complete thoughtlessness about it. There's not some grand strategy, which is the world now looks like this. We're moving beyond this status quo. It's going to require certain costs and it'll bring certain benefits. But there's just no wider conversation about what's happening either at the level of the political class or, well, one would understand that, or the media. I mean, I didn't know this until I read the book. The first meeting of the UN General Assembly was in Methodist Hall in Westminster. Right, yeah. I mean, that's extraordinary. And we're just giving all of that up, like you say. And there's no public conversation about it.
Yeah, I think this is a sign of the British political media emerges is really quite shocking. The absence of understanding, of knowledge, of values. Everything's about strategy, and nothing is about right and wrong, except that it's very safe for a lot to support Israel and to mock the people who stand up against what they see to be a genocide, which is the protesters.
Because you've been in the media a long time, I mean, I didn't need to introduce you with your credentials because our viewers know you very well. I will do that, but also we've had you in the past. You're a former, correct me if I'm wrong, political editor at The Spectator.
Yes.
Which is a pretty big role for the centre-right in this country. When do you think the media changes to this sort of vacuous, gossip-riddled sort of black hole that you've sort of described there? When does that shift happen?
Yeah, I think it happens. It comes from America. I think it's with the rise of neoconservatism. The reason I say that is you start to get it in the run up to the Iraq War. Because the neocons brought this doctrine that might is right. And the rules-based international order, it doesn't matter or doesn't even exist. Actually, it's something which we do what we want, and we're still getting that now. But that had a huge effect on me at the time because the frivolity of invading Iraq and then Libya and then Helmand and so on. Then Brexit, it was a new sort of dimension of ignorance, really. There was a sort of the absence of serious discussion. I mean, if you go back, I was young a boy or a young man in the 70s. And actually read the New Statesman then and The Spectator. It was full of quite heavyweight stuff. Serious discussions about Britain's role in the world, and that has almost gone. And as you rightly say, the rise of the gossip and smears. I mean, the role of media now is as an appendage to power, and rather than as an attempt to describe the world as it is. And that is a. And then if you look at Gaza, it's quite similar in a way, the coverage of Gaza to Brexit. All the main papers supported Brexit, barring the Murdoch, Telegraph, Mail, all behind Brexit, all behind Israel, to an almost fanatical extent. And there were various other sort of horrific errors, all behind the Iraq invasion. And they act now as a club. There's not really, it's very hard to differentiate actually between the Telegraph and GB News and the Spectator and all of, it's a single worldview. And on the one hand, you have the Western civilization. And on the other hand, you have the wokeists and the Islamists and every other ist you can think of on the other side, and the Palestinians, who were by definition sort of terrorists. We've seen a bit of that lately, a bit more of that lately. And there's no real serious attempt to explain what any of these words mean or whether this narrative is true. The ability for lies to enter the mainstream and stay there is almost unlimited.
One sort of moment, you're talking about the heavyweight discourse sometimes that you'd see in the British media landscape 50 years ago, 40 years ago. One good example for me is The Sun told its readership to vote for Thatcher in 1979.
Yes.
And Larry Lamb, not the actor Larry Lamb, a different Larry Lamb, was the editor. And I think there was an op-ed in The Sun imploring its readers to vote for Thatcher. And of course, The Sun had been a pro-Labour newspaper for most of its existence before it's purchased by Murdoch, I think in 1969. And it's a 1,400-word op-ed about voting for Margaret Thatcher in The Sun. You know, that's something you now associate with the London Review of Books or something, you know? Well, and it just shows you how much has changed in the country's media.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you still get 1,400-word articles appear, probably too many of them because the media can't really run budgets to do proper news anymore. So long think pieces.
That's true.
Are unfortunately quite common. And actually, the Sun later went on. There was a brilliant leader writer, Ron Spark. If you ever come across, he lived in a little room underneath a staircase in the Sun, and he set off. He could do in 8 paras what what most of us could do in 2,000 words.
Speaking of this change, I think that's right. Really, with 2000, post 9/11, post Iraq, and the neocons, you just outline.
You see, the neocons are important because it took complexity out of the argument.
Yes,
I mean, you just the Saddam Hussein was bad. That's all you needed to know. He was a bad man.
Yeah.
And that, rather than the consequences of going in, what happens if we invade? Will we be able to govern? That kind of discourse vanished, and a lot of US-based writers turned up who articulated this kind of analysis and this worldview, and it became, for an old-fashioned correspondent who could capture the nuance and explain how the world actually worked, they almost vanished from the scene.
One thing I do like in this book actually is you'll make a point, not necessarily an argument, it's an observation, and then you'll say, for a competing perspective on this, X says this, and it's a footnote. On the changing nature of basically the centre-right, I mean, this is not a media figure, it's a politician, but I had no idea actually how overtly supportive of international law Thatcher was. You talk about Lord Carrington driving the Venice Declaration of 1980, which had the then European Economic Community recognising, quote, the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. And then, and I was totally unaware of this, you cite an interview she had with the Jewish Chronicle with Monty Modlin. He accused Britain of being, quote, the leading advocate of the Arab case against Israel, to which Thatcher replies, I uphold international law. Once we go away from that, we shall not know where we are. And it's very odd that Margaret Thatcher, who's this iconic hero of people like Rishi Sunak and the various outlets you just described a moment ago, she was more committed to international law than any of those guys today.
Yeah, and I think that represented her generation. Remember, she was a young woman during World War II. That's the first thing. So she grew up in the consequences of the collapse of the League of Nations, really, in the 30s, and she was there. She was at the birth of the United Nations, etc. And so, even though she was very pro-Israel, she would happily hand out real bollockings attended by suspension of arms sales, etc., to the Israeli leadership when in the 1980s. There are other factors. I think one of Thatcher was guided also by geopolitical considerations. The Arab states in the 70s were generally pro-Palestinian. And Britain, it was the Foreign Office was able to argue, look, we need to keep the Saudis on board or the Kuwaitis or whoever it may be. Whereas now, really, the Gulf despotisms are just are anti-Palestinian. They won't say so publicly, but they hate Hamas, and they have a common interest with Israel. They've moved. The Abraham Accords is a massive new development, which probably will see the light of day properly at some stage, I think, if we go on current trends. And so the fear of the Arab lobby, as it were, has gone away.
Do you think the likes of Saudi Arabia, UAE would like to see Palestine or would like to see Gaza ethnically cleansed? Or
yes, that's what I think.
What's your?
I tell you what,
evidence. What informs your suspicions?
Here's an article I've always kept on meaning to get around to writing. If you read Bob Woodward's latest book on the Biden presidency, I mean, these tedious books beyond belief is one of it. Yeah, but he has this fascinating interview with accounts based on sort of first-hand sources of Blinken going around the Middle East after the 7th of October. And the message you get from each of these states is, take out Hamas, take out. We can't say this publicly, just take them out. And so, in other words, there's no... and actually, I didn't fully put this into the book. I hadn't fully worked it out. That one of the things which has changed since the 80s is the fact that the Arab states are so pro-Israel, even though they won't say so publicly. They can't because of their domestic. But the tiny elites that run these despotisms are absolutely, really on the side of Israel.
Towards the start of the book, you broached this hugely emotional issue of children that died on October the 7th. And you're very clear about some of the horrors that happened. And again, you go into really forensic detail. And things were so bad, it reminds you that nobody needed to make anything up. But one of the things that was made up was this claim about 40 children being beheaded and mutilated by Hamas. You talk about, and of course, 2 children dying is too many. You talk about 1 child being shot while they're in a safe room, and another...
shot through a door, yeah.
Yeah.
They weren't being targeted, yeah.
And another child, there was a pregnant woman, and she went into labour, and that child tragically died. Both horrific, but of course, that's not 40 children being put in ovens and being beheaded and all kinds of things. Where did those claims come from? And how come the media, and you detail the various outlets and how quickly they repeated that, how come the media, from the Express, the Mail, to the Telegraph, how come they were so happy to repeat all of that stuff without a shred of evidence?
Immediately after 7th of October, the British journalists are sent to Israel, and they want to go to the crime scene, the atrocity scenes, and that's their job. And I mean, in their defence, there you are. You're a senior, you're a reporter. And you get these voluntary organisations. There's an organisation called Zaka, which I think looks after sort of dead bodies generally, and they start to brief a lot of these horrifying stories. Do you check them? I mean, of course they should have checked them, but you're working to a deadline. You've got the story which is going to be the splash. You've got your news desk, would be outraged if you sort of went off and made too many checks. Even quite, I'm not going to name them, but quite very respectable journalists who I admire did this, and I've written to some of them, and they admit they got it wrong, and they just said we're working under pressure. We don't have the benefit of hindsight. Is their basic answer. Some of those stories are still up there, but you need to remember, though, that this was atrocity propaganda. It was then used by Netanyahu to spread the idea that these Hamas fighters, who, by the way, had committed terrible atrocities, like absolute barbarians, the Hamas are and it sort of legitimizes what Israel goes on to do, because these are actually outside humanity. They are worthless as human beings, and we must now go and eliminate this. And I think that they were. Now, whether these journalists were being used, they didn't. I don't think I found evidence that they were getting their stories directly from Israeli government sources. They tended to be getting it from civil society organizations or. And the stories did turn out, the 40 differ-headed babies classically, as hogwash. Still, sometimes they're still being repeated. I mean, they were then reiterated by Western politicians. Biden certainly came up with them. And of course, it just helps to create a mood in which Israel is to be supported in whatever it does.
Yeah, you cite Zaka and you talk about a gentleman called Yossi Landau. And Sam Greenhill here, the quote is, "Of all the massacres in this kibbutz settlement, this one is the worst I've heard, not seen, or seen any evidence for. A military commander's just told me that he saw 19 bodies at this house, including 8 babies. There were no 8 babies. And none of this was actually falsified until Al Jazeera's investigative unit do this deep dive, and they speak to Yossi Landau, and he actually says, well, no, they weren't children. There was an 18-year-old, and which, again, it's horrific. You say it's war crimes. These were war crimes on October the 7th. But the point of journalism is to get to the truth of the matter and provide listeners and readers and viewers with the facts. And that's where there was a huge failure.
And it went on, I think, so this chapter is very heavily based on the astonishingly good film a scrupulous film by Richard Sanders, produced for Al Jazeera, as I say, he basically debunked the atrocity stories and confronted the people who'd spread the stories. Now, it's worth saying, though, that the British media totally ignored that film by Richard Sanders, the Al Jazeera film. It should have picked it up. There should have been a reckoning at that point. You would have hoped that, yes, we got it wrong on the day, but we were working under pressure and we had plausible sources. But no, this is the truth. And generally speaking, the media didn't do that at all. In fact, quite a lot of the stories are still up and you can read them online.
Well, I suspect if you were to get a YouGov poll and ask most members of the public if that had happened or not, I mean, quite explicably, they would say, well, of course it did. That's what the media said, and nobody's confounded it since. Particularly that idea of dozens of babies in ovens. I mean, I can only imagine that's been fabricated. This is just my view. And again, what happened was horrific, but it's been fabricated in order to elicit certain associations, historical associations with what happens 80 years ago, because there was not a shred of evidence for it. But like you say, journalists are working to deadlines and there are quasi-reliable sources. And I get it, the first draft of history. What do you think explains the lack of going back to it? Because if let's say I'm on the BBC or GB News or Sky and somebody raises that, let's talk about the children or being beheaded or in ovens, and I'll say that's complete nonsense, not true. People will get visibly upset about actually pushing back against fabrication. Why is that?
I think you have to ask the organisations concerned because they didn't. I mean, did BBC Verify ever, go there? I think that film by Sanders was newsworthy. It should have been confronted. And it's not the only time at all where the mass media, whether it's the BBC or Sky or the big papers, have published rubbish and refused to go back and re-examine their reporting.
Another example of this is the embedded journalism of somebody like Douglas Murray, who goes into Gaza with the IDF, which to an extent is understandable. It's a war zone. You don't have many options to get in. Israel's not letting journalists in through other means. When Douglas Murray is in Gaza reporting on these things, is he doing so as a propagandist or as a journalist?
Well, my view is that he went in as a propagandist. I do analyse 3 of these embeds. And one of them is Douglas Murray, and who goes on about, he explains later there's only two ways to be in Gaza. One is to be embedded with the IDF, and the other is to have the permission of Hamas, actually. And Hamas are not very good hosts and are untrustworthy hosts. I think the charge I lay at Douglas Murray is that, I mean, the Israelis may be just as untrustworthy as hosts as he says Hamas were. And there's quite a lot of evidence, actually, that Hamas doesn't interfere. In 2014, during Protective Edge, I mean, the journalists, were quite complimentary in a way about the kind of their freedom of action under Hamas, whereas Murray's dispatch fails to ask a lot of key questions about what's going on. I'm being generous there, probably. And is open to the charge that it is war propaganda. And let's be, look at, it does raise also issue. There is another point to be made here, that this always happens in wars. If you look at what happened in the reporting from Kuwait after it was captured by Saddam Hussein in 1990, or whether it's World War I, the raping of the Belgian nuns, it's absolutely so generally speaking, you are going to, in the run-up to Iraq, sort of terrible stories which turned out to be fabrications were published about Saddam Hussein's soldiers.
There's the famous one, isn't there, before the first Gulf War, about babies in incubators in Kuwait and the incubators being unplugged. I mean, they're so fantastic. You think, well, that's so awful. It can't be true. Of course, it isn't true.
And I think there was an absence of skepticism. And it's worth also saying that the atrocities committed by Hamas were sufficiently serious and terrible that you didn't actually need to go and manufacture other ones.
Do you think social media plays a role here? Because from my perspective, if in the middle of all that, you were to say, we have contacts in Israel or in Gaza, they're saying this isn't true, this happened, it's awful, but this other stuff, it's just not true, you would be cancelled.
You would, yeah.
By various politicians, various people in the media. They would literally try and stop in real time your ability to earn a living via journalism.
Yeah, it would.
And that feels like a new edge to things, which wasn't there 25 years ago because these platforms didn't exist. But something like Owen Jones, for instance, who doesn't get everything right. Nobody gets everything right. But, he was one of those people who said, actually, this claim about the 40 children, being in ovens and being beheaded is not true. And the most appalling things were said about him. People were campaigning for him to lose his Guardian column. He should be defunded by YouTube and so on. And the truth is, he was right. But even if he's not right, you're entitled to ask questions.
Yeah, actually, thank you for telling me about Owen Jones, who's been magnificent throughout this war, by the way, exposing media complicity and hypocrisy, etc. And yeah, it's a very good example that you're quite afraid if you're going to try and challenge a dominant narrative. You are kicked into the outer darkness. You're unspeakable. You're worthless. You're anti-Semite. You go, etc., etc.
Has that happened to you? On this particular issue?
Do you know? I mean, not particularly. I'm interested in the response to this book because it's not been reviewed in a single mainstream paper at all. Or the magazines, but there's been no attacks on it either. It's just a sort of weird. I got very nice reviews in thank you Novara Media for seeing me, and also I got reviews in sort of Jacobin, I think, and Morning Star, but declassified. But it's not. You don't get. He's been completely blanked by the mainstream media, and I was rather imagining there would be some serious attacks on it, but they haven't happened either.
That's really telling. I did see the book in foils.
Oh, really?
This week, so there you go. Yeah,
that's very. Were foils in Waterloo? Is it or
no? The main Charing Cross. Yeah, I was just in the cafe doing. I think I was actually reading this for a bit of research, and I saw it on there. Was it the third floor? Politics.
Oh, well, it's got somewhere, yeah. It has. It's in Waterstones, so good old Waterstones, yeah. And So I'm very grateful. Actually, it went briefly on first week into the Sunday Times number 10 of the Sunday Times bestseller list.
Well, that's really impressive.
Yeah, without any particular notice.
The point you're making, though, about nobody reviewing this is something you relied upon as well with Avi Schleim and Ilan Pappé. And I've heard you say this before, but it's again, you repeat it in the book. These are two of the most eminent historians on Israel, not even just Israel, Gaza, just Israeli historians that work in the English-speaking world. Two of the most eminent. And yet, I think Avi Schleim has been on the BBC once, you said.
William Crawley invited him onto Radio Ulster, which was good for him, actually, after that was earlier this year, after about 2 years of the thing.
And Ilan, I don't think, has been on the BBC since October.
I wrote to both of them asking them if they had. I mean, it's amazing. I find that, whereas, Douglas Murray was invited on Newsnight all sorts of loudmouths go on to Question Time and spout on about Gaza, whereas the people who actually know about it are not allowed in. I think this point, that has to be deliberate. The BBC is a big enough organisation to know who Avi Schleim is. And I think it's evidence that they are determined not to present this issue fairly.
Do you think they've been blacklisted?
They don't operate blacklists, I don't think, the BBC. They don't, not formal blacklists, but informal blacklists. I'm told by people who work there that, they certainly exist. I
mean, you'd think just purely by accident, one of them would have been on a few times.
No. It's definitely the case that I think the BBC, and I have asked the BBC, I've asked them why they haven't had Avi Schleim, and they don't answer.
I mean, we've done interviews with Ilan. I think one of them's got, 2.5 million views. Another one's got, he's a very, his perspective is very popular and very interesting for large numbers of people. So the idea there's no demand for Ilan Pappé has to say, who, runs a department on this stuff in a British university. Yeah,
and he wrote a book which is totally relevant to this. There were several books since October the 7th. A big book on the pro-Israel lobby in Britain and America. Very relevant, absolutely. It was not reviewed anywhere.
No.
And I think the books pages of our papers, books editors, are pathetic. And this is new. I mean, there was a time when difficult stuff, it was interesting, it was controversial. You were engaging with subjects people didn't understand. But now, there is no serious attempt to explain the world to more than one version of the world and foreign affairs to a British audience.
Why do you think the British media are sticking with this about not talking to certain people or not talking about certain things? They don't want to talk about the Israel lobby, and we'll talk about...
They don't make that. The Dahia doctrine, which is absolutely central to the whole thing, is not mentioned. It wasn't for ages. Hannibal Directive, you can't understand October the 7th without it, not mentioned. You get your better chance. If you read, it's not just if you read Haaretz, which is an immense paper. I'm looking forward very much to reading Alan Rusbridger's sort of article on it in Prospect. They've reported a lot of stuff which is going on, revealed a lot of Israeli crimes. So has 972 magazine, and so has sort of the Times of Israel and the Jerusalem Post occasionally, because they're concerned what's going on. The hostages, they will get involved in, whereas Britain is very, very, doesn't want to hold Israel up for scrutiny in relation to its conduct in Gaza or outside, like these awful torture camps which Israel runs, which are terribly well documented now, where since I think more than approximately 100 Palestinians have died in them since October the 7th. And I met a survivor. He'd lost more than half his body weight. He was terrified to meet me. He thought I was coming to just beat him. He'd been beaten every day for 9 months. So somebody had died in the next cell. I mean, died, I think, means tortured to death, don't you? I mean, they won't allow in health or, the Red Cross or whatever. And this is not covered generally. There's occasionally the papers stretch out towards a story about it, but if Britain was doing something like this, was treating people in our prisons, it would be massive stories, Sunday Times exposés.
The opposition will be all over it, that's for sure.
Yeah, and there's a sort of reluctance to report fairly on what's been going on.
The story about rape being used as a method of torture, I think, was broken by Haaretz, which for people who aren't familiar
It's certainly
with it,
covered well by Haaretz.
Yeah, is a liberal Zionist newspaper in Israel, very mainstream paper. The Jerusalem Post is the country's oldest paper as well. They've done some...
It goes back to the 30s, yeah.
Yeah, it's done some pretty big stuff. And you make this observation that, that Haaretz certainly has had op-eds or reporting that, if that happened in the UK by a British outlet, they would be, again, to use that word, cancelled.
They would.
Haaretz can do it, but we can't,
Yeah, I find this very odd. I find this extremely strange.
And what's driving that, do you think? The lobby over here?
Again, I think honestly, I think we need to ask the editors of these papers why they don't. I have a correspondence of the BBC in which generally they just don't answer the questions or give answers which seem to me to be inaccurate. I haven't written to the editors of the Times, the Telegraph, or the Mail, who all have questions to answer about their basic reluctance to cover stories which put Israel in a poor light in the way it's conducted itself in Gaza. And I think they just simply don't want to know. There's a sort of weird world out there, and it exists in Westminster, but across both main parties. You can't mention the term genocide. You can't mention the term apartheid, even though every major human rights organization in the world says basically that Israel is not only committing apartheid, but is committing genocide. But that is not acceptable in political discourse. And so you have a parallel reality existing in the media political system. And only Novara's done well, declassified. I mean, there's an enormous issue with British military involvement. And to how extensive has it been, and what have we actually been doing? And this is it has slightly changed. It's getting slightly better. The Times defence editor has done something good on it lately, but it took an age for anybody even to pick this up. Whereas Declassified, which has about 3 reporters, has been doing stunning stuff, and Matt Kennard, who's no longer there. And why does it have to be that the mainstream papers are no longer interested in telling difficult truths or truths which interfere with their basic position on foreign policy?
I thought this recently with this poor man, the serviceman who died in Ukraine. And we're told it's an accident. I have no reason to disbelieve that. And we're hearing from MI6 and the chief of staff that we should prepare for war. And a Brit's died in Ukraine. We weren't even aware of what role they had in Ukraine, really. And this is big stuff. We should probably know why he was there, what he was doing, how many of our people are in Ukraine. And I know to some extent you can't be totally honest, of course. But if it means that we might be dragged into a global conflagration.
Yeah, we've now been told.
It would be quite useful to know,
We're now being told something like World War III is around the corner, aren't we?
Yeah. While also not being told, how many of our people are there.
Or why, really. I mean, it's... I think that is another point. And if you looked at the coverage of these statements by the chief of the defence staff and the head of MI6, they were basically just amplifying it. Or they weren't questioning. Those one or two reporters outside the system sort of said, "What's going on here?" And they were slammed, for being unpatriotic. Now, we've been here before. It's exactly how we walked blindfolded into World War I, by the way. World War II was a bit more scrutiny.
So expand on that.
Well, World War I was the decision was made by a tiny elite, Lord Grey and Asquith and the military high commands in 1914. We're told they'll be back by Christmas. They were. In our church, I can look at the names of the dead. Yeah. We've done a project into their lives and what they were doing before, and they come back and they're killed, and their brothers are killed, and 1 million people are killed. There was never any proper explanation to the British public. It was just accepted. The papers were all gung-ho. And of course, they regretted it afterwards. It's fascinating. I mean, the Daily Mail was having one of the great trumpeteers for World War One. The Harmsworths, of course, lost their son, and then really grieved about it and tried to understand why they were a million young men were being killed for no reason at all on the Western Front. And you can see this here. I think that this is the same. There is a kind of, and it's new, there is a kind of, authoritarianism is not quite the right word, but you're all expected to have the same opinion and not to question authority. When I was at school in the 1970s, and this was the height of the Cold War, we had a wonderful teacher called Graham Stevenson. And he was a Russian scholar, he was the head of the history department, and he would take Soviet Weekly. And he invited down the Soviet political officer from the embassy in London, and he talked to us at the sixth form, historians, and it was brilliant. And why is it no longer accepted? We've kicked, Soviet. What's that? That Russia Today thing off into Dubai now. It lives. Why can't we listen to other points of view? Yeah, I don't understand it. Instead of which we listen to this slightly, I have to say, the new head of MI6.
Blaise Metroelli, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's an inheritor of the job which the wretched Scarlet of ill fame, the man who was the head of the JIC when it produced the dossier which justified the illegal Iraq war, and Richard Dearlove, who produced the intelligence which went into that dossier. They're both former heads of MI6. They were completely found out, and given knighthoods. I couldn't understand why. I mean, and now we have MI6 coming out and playing a role which seems to me to be entirely inappropriate and a misunderstanding of what it's meant to do. MI6 is, I know one or two former SIS people quite well. And under Thatcher, they say that something did change under Thatcher. There was, the role in the old days was to warn, if you do this, watch out for that. The law of unintended consequences. Yeah. And something happened in late Thatcher, they say, and it got much worse under Blair, was it became a propaganda wing for British security interests or British governments. And it feels to me a little bit, and I know nothing about it, I have nobody there at the moment at all. You see, I don't want to claim I'm some kind of security expert, but it scares the living daylights out of me.
We had, the chief of the general staff, who's never been a military pilot. I mean, I didn't even know this until a couple of days, an engineer. And he's saying that we're going to have to give up our sons and daughters.
Yes.
For it's not quite clear what.
For. I agree. And then there's a lack of skepticism, which it's not as if our great military leaders have got a tremendous record of getting things right. It's not as if Iraq we were defeated in Iraq. We were defeated. We were flung out of Helmand. Among carnage, among very brave young men. Libya was a total and utter disaster. And so our record of our military chiefs in sending us into combat is dire. And so why are we now assuming that this new war, which we're being alerted to, against Russia, who's, by the way, has nuclear weapons, in case you didn't notice. And again, if you go back to tell me I'm boring you, but you go back to the 1970s, where we all watched The War Game, which was this amazing film of what happens if you get a thermonuclear war. And the military doctrine, which was totally accepted by the military establishment in Britain and in Russia, was mad, mutually assured destruction. it just guaranteed that you weren't going to go war with each other. And so when the Russians marched into Czechoslovakia in '68, which I remember vividly, there was no sense that we were going to march back in ourselves. Tragic though that was, I mean, and the reason for it was quite simple. They had nuclear weapons as well. And they still have nuclear weapons, and yet we seem to be on a mission to have this existential battle for Ukraine. Well, there have been peace deals on the table. And the question I would like to know is why did MAD apply as a military doctrine or in the 1970s or while the Soviet Union existed, and why did some reason it not apply now?
I read a recent book by Serhii Plokhy, his new one about the nuclear age. And, you use that word thermonuclear. And it's really interesting just to see politicians, they're not too worried about the atom bomb, right? Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're horrific, but it's, similar levels of damage can be done by, conventional bombing, although over a lot longer period of time, of course. And then the thermonuclear weapons turn up, the hydrogen bombs. And these are so much more powerful than even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's just this collective mind shift amongst, policymakers this side of the Iron Curtain and, of course, in the USSR too. And they go, okay, well, this is crazy. I mean, the Tsar bomber, I think to this day, is the largest ever weapon, most powerful weapon, most, in terms of explosive power, most powerful weapon ever created by humanity. As I understand it, and I know this sounds implausible, it had more explosive power than all the munitions used over the entirety of the Second World War. They didn't actually drop it on the land. It exploded mid-air because it would have irradiated too much. And like you say, the possibility of weapons like that, and to be clear, there's nothing like the Tsar bomber in the possession of the former Soviet Union countries or the UK or the US any longer. But yeah, nobody seems to take it seriously anymore. And I'm not quite sure why. It's not that we've uninvented the technology.
No. And it's quite likely to happen. History also teaches us that it's quite likely to happen.
So you think there'll be some sort of nuclear conflict at some point?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that history teaches us that wars break out.
Yeah.
World War I is the big comparison.
Do you think it's possible we sleepwalk into something similar to that?
Well, I don't. Yeah, the war wouldn't be the same.
Not the same scale, but the same level of stupidity.
Well, it could be the same scale. There's nobody saying it wouldn't be, but I think that's exactly what we're potentially wandering towards, and without anybody. Now, another thing which is missing from the current discourse is Starmer not saying anything. I mean, you'd expect if he says we're halfway to gets the head of MI6 to say we're in a sort of semi-conflict. You'd expect the Prime Minister to address the country to say, look, excuse me, I haven't mentioned this before, but we're actually halfway at war with Russia, and this means we're going to be sending people. I mean, but no, nothing from Starmer, who is a sort of curiously present and absent leader. He doesn't. I don't think he doesn't understand any of this, does he? I mean, he's out to lunch, isn't he? And when it comes to this sort of stuff, I mean, does he know anything about it? It reminds me of Asquith again, actually, sort of a lawyer in World War I. Asquith, very clever, very engaging man, but he sort of didn't. He was in charge theoretically, along with the king, but it all happened without him really noticing, I think.
I'll ask you one more question, and it's not really related to Gaza or even foreign policy necessarily. What does UK politics look like with Nigel Farage as PM? We've been talking about a set of trajectories, that really intensify under Blair, really intensify after 2000. What's the big picture with, Farage in Downing Street? We become essentially the 51st state. I mean, it feels like we can't go any further in that direction, frankly. If you look at Farage, I'm reading a very good book on fascism at the moment, just to try and work out whether or not he might be a potential fascist. And I think he isn't. He's not, because fascists go into sort of aggressive war quite quickly. Now he is, in my view, a racist.
he's bitterly hostile to minorities. He stirs things up. He's a populist. In those ways, he's quite similar to Trump. He is hostile to the British state, the rule of law. He lives on an evil rhetoric of division. I don't think he has the capability to be prime minister. I mean, it would be Liz Truss territory.
You think?
Yeah. So he would assemble around him. We know the sort of people we can see the people who are advising him. They're not serious people. His political allies would be Oborne, whoever inherits from Trump, Le Pen in France. He might be popular for a bit because he's quite funny, isn't he? People like Farage, there he is smoking and drinking with his cronies in Downing Street. I think it would be the beginning. Well, I think we passed the beginning of the end stage of the British state. It would be the beginning of the. It would. I think it would lead to the breakup of the Union. I think he is also just politically clueless because he would carry the logic of the post-Brexit Tories to their conclusion. The civil service is a bloody nightmare. Yeah, and why does he think the civil service is a nightmare? Because they stand in the way of his super rich billionaire cronies. So it would be, as you rightly said, we would be run by these half a dozen oligarchs, Musk and so on. We would become, you put it well, the NHS would be handed to some faceless billionaire, wouldn't it? And he would be going to. What a thought! I don't think it'll happen. I don't think that Britain is going to put him in. I think we're decent people.
We'll see. On that note, Peter, it's been a pleasure to talk to you as ever. And this is your book, well-thumbed version on my part. Happy to say it's very, very good. And like I said, it's a really good reference book as much as anything else because you've just compiled all the important information and data. So thanks for writing it and thanks for coming on Downstream.
A great pleasure. Thank you for having me on.